I've decided to like old things now. The idea struck me just as hard as this record player. I just love how things were done before the 2000s. Hyperinflation hadn't caught on yet, and there were so many cool things that happened in the 1900s. It was the era in which gaming was born, unless you don't count everything leading up to Miitopia from the Nintendo Switch. But animation was also starting to catch on as a medium of entertainment during this time, and I just love the feel of those old-timey rubber-hose cartoons. It also makes me feel like I lived through the Great Depression. And there happens to be a game out there that tries to replicate this style of animation. So basically, someone's trying to revitalize a corpse with an Xbox, which can only mean a bad thing for society. Cuphead is an indie run-and-gun game inspired by the animation style of the 1930s Fleischer cartoons. And right away, this game definitely stands out, but more on that later. How did this game come to be? What did it go through to get to its release? Probably hell. The general idea of the game dates all the way back to the year 2000, in which the Moldenhauer brothers attempted to make a game inspired by the cartoons they grew up loving. Yet it was scrapped very early on because of many limitations in development. But a decade later, after the indie success that was Super Meat Boy, it was fair to give the concept another shot. Because if Super Meat Boy can do it, so can I. All I need to do is sell over 1 million copies. And so, development on the game continued, which is a great way to skip 7 years on the calendar. Yeah, this game was in development for longer than usual, and that doesn't show signs of how the people working on the project didn't know what they were doing. It was more so because that's what was necessary for the game to function as well as it does. I'm guessing most of the time went to the animation, because some of these techniques were ancient. Comparing this to pixel art is like comparing my grandma to Thomas Jefferson. He's dead. I feel like many indie games try to go for a pixel art style because it makes players go like, whoa, I remember that. I'm gonna go heckle my dad for playing the Atari. But this game instantly stands out because of its art style. There truly isn't anything else like it. So the game released on the Xbox One as well as the Windows in 2017, which I always found to be weird. Cuphead never screamed Xbox to me. I'd be deaf otherwise. It felt alright on the platform, but I think it was born to be a Switch game. It might just be my Nintendo bias kicking in, but this game just has a certain charm that I find to be in common with many first-party Nintendo games. Sure, that logic falls apart when you consider that this game is also about gambling and the devil, but I'm not gonna act like Nintendo is any stranger to that either. So I'm glad it was later brought to the platform, as well as the PS4, which, sure, gotta cover all the bases here. So no matter who you are, you can probably get your hands on this game, and for a cheap price. Because for how many years went into making this, $20 is a steal. But before the game came out on the Switch, I resorted to treason. This game convinced me to get a Steam account, and to this day, it is still the only game I own for PC, because no matter how many people keep telling me that playing games for PC is the way to go, I'm still gonna ignorantly read the Super Mario All-Stars manual. But that just goes to show how big this game was when it released. Even me, not having a Steam account or even an Xbox One, wanted to get one of the two just because of this game having such an appealing concept. Most of the game surrounds the boss-oriented gameplay. Instead of having typical stages, this game has numerous bosses that you have the opportunity to strangle, with some even being airplane-based fights. All of the bosses have multiple faces that can get pretty wacky in their designs. Some of them make complete sense and are perfect evolutions of what you get at the start. Grim Matchstick starts out as a normal dragon, but grows 2 more heads to become a Hydra. That makes sense. Most of the bosses are like this, but then you have Ribby and Croaks who just turn into a slot machine. I just find transformations like this utterly hilarious because it's what you would least expect. And that's not to mention that each of these phases have completely different patterns for you to memorize. So most of it's based on trial and error, as once you start playing each phase more and more, you start to understand their patterns and you can predict which move they're gonna make on you next. It's like how I faced disappointment so many times that I know what's gonna happen next. I can't wait to be crushed by a mini fridge, among other things. I might as well mention some of my favorite bosses in the game. Dr. Call was really fun to me. There's so many things to take into account during the first phase, which is a stark contrast to the last phase where it just throws everything it has at you, while in reality, there isn't much here outside of seeing if you can survive. The Roo Pack is the first boss of the game, but I do love how it teaches you the basics of the game itself, positioning its first phase on one side of the screen so you can learn range, the second phase in the middle so you can know what to do in tight spaces, and the last phase gives you the whole screen, but it's the hardest to hit because you have to move around so much. And I know everyone loves to gush about this one, but the King Dice fight is so neat with how much variety it has. And if you can rig the dice to land on the mini boss you want, the fight becomes infinitely more enjoyable. But you have to take these bosses down with the weapons that you shoot from your finger. No wonder this is offensive nowadays. There are multiple shots to choose from, and you can form different strategies around each one. Not every single boss is going to go down with the same 2 shots, so you'll have to become flexible in terms of being comfortable with each shot. The only one I never cared for that much was the charge shot. It isn't bad, I would just rather rather choose any other shot. And there are also charms that grant different abilities in battle, though the only two in the base game that I consider useful are the auto parry and the smoke dash. The only time I ever saw coffee being used was in airplane fights if you wanted to do powerful attacks more often to make the flight not last as long. The charms are a decent addition, I just wish some of the other ones were a bit more useful. But the bosses in this game are some of the best in the business, which is what makes some of the other types of levels look weak in comparison. Namely, the running gun levels. I like them, so they're on par with sporks to me. In these levels, you have to get to the end of a side-scroller stage with the typical weak enemies blocking your path along the way. And it does feel like a natural progression of the bosses, as this is also based on trial and error, seeing if you remember what enemies do what and if you remember what platforms are where. My problem is that I just find taking down the bosses to be way more fun. You can get coins from these levels to buy weapons and charms, but you don't really have to complete any of these levels in order to beat the game. It's a perfectly serviceable part of the game, but I'd say it's one of the game's more forgettable aspects because of how much the bosses overshadow it. The mausoleums are parry-based challenges where you must protect an urn from a horde of ghosts that attempt to surround it, and these are way too easy. You can beat them first try no problem. Unlike the running guns, which at least carried some of that trial and error from the bosses, the mausoleums don't even bring error into the equation. All of them are nearly the same. The idea of a parry-based challenge is neat, but the mausoleums don't do much with the idea. You do get the super attacks here, which are very helpful in battle, but because you can't even revisit them upon defeat, I find it to be one of the biggest missed opportunities in the game. If the running gun levels were like sporks, the mausoleums are more like thumbtacks. But one thing the game is notorious for is its difficulty, as this game makes up for its low amount of bosses by making every single one of them have complex attack patterns that take people hours upon hours to get a grip on. And to me, I still don't see it. I might just be saying that because I'm better at this game than you stupid losers. But I never found this game to be all too hard to understand. And the only time in which I did was when I first played it on Windows. I had never used a keyboard as a controller before this. I considered using one of these to be no different from war crimes. Beating the game on Switch was a walk in the park though. And even after setting it down for 2 whole years, coming back to it didn't prove to be any challenge at all. I stopped playing the game in May 2020 for 2 reasons. One, I had finally S-ranked every boss, meaning that you have to go for every boss without getting hit, while getting 3 parries, 6 of your super meter cards depleted, and a strict time limit while in expert mode. And the other reason was because right after I did so, Paper Mario the Origami King's trailer dropped, and as did my mental stability. As the big Paper Mario cultist that I am, I was basically left to do nothing for the next month outside of trying to find shelter. And I just recently came back to it, to, as I said, almost no challenge. It was actually way easier than before. I started a new file and S-ranked every boss within a few days, and a few sleepless nights. Now as to why I returned, I'll get to that later, because it's once again time to compliment the animation of this game, and I just wanted to point out that this is probably why the game is so well remembered. The amount of effort that went into capturing this style shouldn't go underappreciated. It's easily one of the best looking games I've ever seen. I like games that have rich and lush environments, as well as worlds with unprecedented amounts of polish, but this game captures the handmade handiwork of the 30s in spectacular fashion. The transformations and expressions are just great to look at. Some of the levels have stop motion objects in the background, and even small things like the grainy texture and unlockable filters you can apply are amazing additions. The rubber hose animation style even contributes to the amazing big band soundtrack, which are some great listens that deserve even more praise than they're already given. Speaking of which, this game was huge back when it released in 2017. Even if you never showed any interest in playing the thing, you at least had to give it credit for just how big of a phenomenon it was. Everyone was playing and reacting to how tricky the bosses were, and that's honestly what made me buy the game in the first place. If everyone else is doing it, why shouldn't I? Driving under the influence is a felony? The game was on top for those first few months as it continued to sell millions of units. Given the success that Studio MDHR found during this time, it was a smart idea to reveal that DLC would be coming to the game in 2019. That was great news, and here we are today. The DLC didn't release until 2022, a total 4 years of waiting after that initial reveal at E3 2018, which just left me confused for the longest time, because word on the project was radio silent, and it kept getting delayed with no official release date in sight. Now this was mostly because of the pandemic everyone was going crazy about. Of course, I have no idea what they were talking about. Yoshi's Crafted World has been holding me captive ever since 2019, so this DLC took longer to produce than if it was worked on in different circumstances. But given the final result, you wouldn't even be able to tell that it had a troubled development. This DLC is exactly what the game needed after being barely talked about for years. It only has 1 aisle's worth of bosses, with there only being 6 big ones, but they're all great, and are some of the best the game as a whole has on offer. There are great new weapons, charms, and even a new playable character that was fun to get used to. Its plot is charming, the animation is better than ever, there are new parry challenges that have you doing more than just parrying random ghosts, and this feels like a perfect end for Cuphead. The DLC is mostly separate from the main game, but it manages to complete everything in such a lighthearted and epic fashion. That final boss of the DLC, the barrage of attacks, incredible animation, and godlike score make this easily the best fight in the game, and one of the best moments I've ever been through in a game. And it just seals that this is one of the best and most prominent indie games to ever be released. This isn't a game you'll find anywhere else. It's so unique and interesting, both as a concept and an execution. The game isn't perfect, I wish the mausoleums were a bit more engaging, and Goopy Legrand isn't my favorite boss, but this game does so much right. From the animation and score to the creativity and inventive bosses, the game doesn't let down on any of those fronts. But you see, I don't count on everything leading up to Miitopia for the Nintendo Switch, so what the heck is a Cuphead, some sort of slur?